All right. Welcome back. We'll go ahead and take any kind of
We
questions.
do have a few questions. Let's jump back into this. Is fun, isn't it? All right.
Oh,
Okay. Selim asks, they will assume you consent to the prosecution by the cop unless you object. We're gonna do a whole section on communicating with the bonded officer. That's something we're going to cover in another session. Eric says on PJ's comment, and he's saying, what gives them the right to ticket? That's
well, it's presumption of law,
right, exactly.
and they're operating off of what they know. I mean,
It,
what do
it
they know?
it's the flashpoint, and we're gonna, like I said in Selim's comment, we're gonna cover, theorize, and discuss how to properly handle the roadside, traffic stop, and what gives them the right to ticket. They're not operating on rights. Okay, cops are operating on code. He says, what I meant is that this right ticket has to derive from state constitution enumerated powers.
Actually, it derives from municipalities' powers and cities' powers.
Well,
It's
it depends.
not
It depends on where they derive their authority, right? See,
exactly.
as Eric says, state of California must enforce as franchise of state of California is given by constitution granted by people of the state of California. Okay, so he's going back to the hierarchy of powers. Okay, the people gave certain authority to the state. This is covered quite well, actually, in another piece of the homework, which is we released the private trust webinar series, webinar 1, to everyone. And if you haven't digested that, and Eric, I know you have, there's a hierarchy of powers, okay? And the people created the state and gave certain powers to the state. The state created the federation, gave certain powers to the federal government, etc. So, yeah, the powers derive from the people originally, and the point is well taken. Okay. Selim says, at least in California, in my dozen or so cases over the same number of years or more, I have no recollection of a prosecutor being present. It was always the cops giving testimony. This is why it's so easy to shut them down during their initial arguments. If the cop is capable of representing the state or the city or whatever, that's that's probably debatable, and I'd have to look up whether that can be done.
That's how I've seen it too. But I agree with you that there always has to be someone there moving the court. That's a given. But I don't ever really know. That's why I brought up the question because I'm not 100% sure, and I'm glad that he brought this up because it's interesting. But I know that you've been there where you've seen people, especially in like DUI cases and things like that. There's always going to be a prosecutor there.
Yeah, that's been my experience. Selim says the private man is not visible in the public courts unless you contract with the judge. It is an offer to contract. Absolutely. California Government Code 54950. The people of this state do not yield their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. The people, in delegating authority, do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. Yep, you get an argument from me.
That's great. Can you read that again?
Sure. It's California Government Code 54950. The people of this state do not yield their sovereignty to the agencies which serve them. The people, in delegating authority, do not give their public servants the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know. The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they've created. It is the basis of the
Over
open
the
meeting
instruments,
laws.
it says right there, over the instruments they've created.
Yep.
Oh, that's magnificent. Thank you.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. The
wonderful.
instruments they've created, because you know what? You consent to, you sign a charging instrument, a negotiable instrument under Article 3 every time you are stopped and a charge is given to you. You accept an offer, and there's a signature, and there's an endorsement, and there's a negotiable instrument that's created, and that creates some form of debt or liability with which you have agreed to be charged and pay. And that is what you're disputing is whether or not you actually agreed to it. That's a major distinction right there. So that's a
Well,
great thing. Go ahead.
You're assuming that I would sign such a thing.
Right, right.
I don't know where you get that sort of assumption. I've been presented with those many times. I tend to not accept them. But we'll get into that. FYI 54950 is for state meetings, and 11120 is for county local public meetings, or vice versa. Todd says a cop is not licensed to practice law. That's true. Neither is a judge, for that matter. He's a bar member, but his bench precludes him from practicing law from the seat he holds.
It is always one time or another to ask if an officer is making a legal determination, or if they are violating a certain right, if they're, as Zach would say, if they're convey private property for public use without just compensation.
WD says that's commonly called the Buck Act. I assume he's talking 54950 is the Buck Act. I don't know. I don't know that term. I've not come across the Buck Act. Thank you for that.
I've heard of the Buck Act, but I'm not 100% familiar with it, so thank you.
Okay. Let's get back to this. The right of the citizen to travel upon the public highways and to transport his property thereon in the ordinary course of life and business is a common right which he has under the right to enjoy life and liberty. That's personal liberty, right? To acquire and possess property and to pursue happiness and safety. It includes the right in doing so to use the ordinary and usual conveyances of the day, and under the existing modes of travel includes the right to drive a horse-drawn carriage or wagon thereon, or to operate an automobile thereon for the usual and ordinary purposes of life and business. That's pretty clear. Let's move on.
Yes, sir. Okay. When the public highways are made the place of business, the state has a right to regulate their use in the interest of safety and convenience of the public. It says it's in the interest of us, as well as the preservation of highways. Now that could be, I could see where they may have abused that in the past, or could abuse it to use as an excuse as to why there are certain violations or certain codifications.
Yeah, but it's very clear that when the public highways are made the place of business, this distinction here is the private use of the highways by the citizen, and the use of the public highways for private gain by a business, right? The state's rights to... Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry, let me present something to you. The idea of littering, for example. Okay, because it talks about the preservation of the highways. Is a private individual not making the public highways a place of business? Are you subject to a regulation in the interest of preservation of the highways as opposed to in the interest of different for the public?
Well, the preservation of the highways they're talking about here, I believe, is the right to tax by way of licensing fees the commercial operators.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Okay, and on the subject of littering, I take you back to Dharma. Okay.
Well, very nice. I understand, but
Right.
I want, and not with an intention, but to understand that there is a public interest in mind. There's always a public interest in a preservation, and if we prevent those things from happening, there need not be a regulation or a violation for it happening. So, we practice, for example, leave no trace, all throughout our life and throughout where we go. So there's certain morals, and it comes back, like you said, to morals and ethics on the concept of that. So I appreciate you bringing up Dharma. That's great. The state to regulate such use is based upon the nature of the business and the use of the highways in connection therewith. That's pretty good. I like that.
It's clear, if you dig, it's clear that the case law is overwhelming. The code does not coincide with the case law. All right, let's look a little further. We covered this before. motor vehicle and used for commercial purposes.
This is a good one. One employed in conducting a coach, carriage, wagon, or other vehicle.
Employed.
So, and in the last definition, we saw motor vehicle as well, where now we see the distinction. Sometimes it'll say vehicle, sometimes it'll say motor vehicle. So we want to, every word makes a big difference.
By the way, Selim confirmed that the 54950 is the Buck Act, as
Yes.
WD pointed out. I love that our people on this call, some of them know this stuff. That's great.
Not only that, but I'm really glad that our newcomers are stepping up and really, stating things. We love the interaction right now. It's just that makes sense.
The permission by competent authority to do an act which without permission would be illegal, a trespass, or a tort. That's license by People v. Henderson. The permission by competent authority to do an act which without permission would be illegal, a trespass, or a tort. Leave to do a thing which licensor could prevent. Okay. In order for these two definitions to apply in this case, the state would have to take up the position that the exercise of a constitutional right to use the public roads in the ordinary course of life and business is illegal, a trespass, or a tort, which the state could then regulate or prevent.
A license is an exemption, it's a privilege, because otherwise they claim it's illegal or they claim it's a trespass upon public roads, and the city and state claims a tort, which, as they're claiming right now, you would have had to have you would have had to have subrogated an unalienable right in order for that to have happened. The state would have to take up the position that the exercise of a constitutional right to use the public roads in the ordinary course of life and business is illegal, a trespass, or a tort, which the state could then regulate and prevent. And that is exactly what's happened. But it happens the first time by consent. And thereafter, it's a presumption of law, as we had spoken of.
Selim has a follow-up to the previous conversation here. Going back to the prosecutor thing for one last time, I've used a demand for a verified complaint twice in Yolo County back in the late 1990s. This is based on CVC 40513B, whereby you can require that the complaint, that's the ticket, be verified. Both times it went to the prosecutor's office. If there were a prosecutor in the courtroom then, they would have stood up at that point. Just a point of comparison to your experience. Most of my battles were in North California counties, Bay Area and Sacramento areas. Well, I think that's perfect, okay? Because what that did was brought them into the courtroom, right? It had to be verified. There had to be somebody really moving this, and either, depending on how you present it in court, either you'll get a dismissal or you'll get a continuance for that person to be there. And verifying it, meaning verify is a great term to look up if you haven't looked it up recently. Verify means sworn. It means oath or affidavit. And so, even that, when that comes back into the courtroom, if you want to get that, to give that credence, you can, okay? But if you have questions for your accuser, that it still doesn't mean anything. An affidavit or a sworn declaration, which in court are the same thing, anything signed under penalty of perjury, is meaningless unless the declarant or affiant is there to answer your questions. So it's accepted in court, but you have the right to question it. And so eventually you can drag someone from that, that corporate office of the government into the courtroom to answer to it. Sam says, I got a continuance in both cases, and when I returned 45 days later, the prosecutor's office had failed to act, and so the commissioner dismissed. Exactly. Yeah, that's my point. Is that you just stand on
Yeah.
that right to question your accuser and don't get off of it. If there's no one in there moving that court, then there needs to be someone in there moving that court, and they can take all the steps they want of continuances and verifications and whatever. But the bottom line is, unless a human shows up there to take the stand or answer your questions, they have no case. Okay, that's all the questions I have for now.
That's great. I like that. The automobile is not inherently dangerous.
This is a really important point because one of the common arguments made is that it has to be regulated, it must be licensed because, it's a weapon of mass destruction on the roads, right? And if we didn't control this with licensing to, maintain the integrity of the driver pool, then, all chaos would break loose. Well, the fact is that the case law says that, the automobile is not inherently dangerous. And uh, if that were even a true complaint, I mean, and this goes back to Dharma too, right? This is like, what how do we get along and uphold natural law, and what duties do we have? And you know it's not in, in case law or in reality true that drivers must be licensed in order to be something other than dangerous on the roads. Okay, we all know that it's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple job driving a car, right? It's a pretty simple thing, and if it's not a job, if it's not your livelihood, then it's a right. And the fact that there's a little bit of a learning curve to it doesn't hold up in court. And there's your case law. And there are others similar to that.
With regard particularly to the U.S. Constitution, it is elementary that a right secured or protected by that document cannot be overthrown or impaired by any state police authority. It is well settled that the constitutional rights protected from invasion by the police power include rights safeguarded both by express and implied prohibitions in the constitutions.
What that brings forth is the express or implied. I've had people tell me more, more than I ever expected in the last 2 weeks. The Constitution doesn't say anything about traveling. There's no constitutional right to travel. You can look through the whole Constitution and it never discusses it. Okay, I'll buy that. But the purpose of the Constitution is not to address my right to travel. The purpose of the Constitution is to limit the powers of government. Okay? And whether it's express or implied, there's no prohibition of it in the Constitution. The Constitution does protect it because
Well, it's a chain. It's a chain of establishment, right? That right is protected by the Constitution. It's one of the several unalienable rights or inalienable rights under the Constitution, unalienable under the Declaration of Independence, that is recognized and protected. So what he's stating, it may not be direct. You may not directly see it under the Constitution, but to immediately link it, it's that easy to establish the link that shows that it is protected by the Constitution.
Well, yeah, and as Sam and Todd both point out, the right to liberty is the expressed protection under the Constitution, and that's true. That is true. WD says there is no thought of right to travel in the Motor Vehicle Code. To require a license, all the state needs to do is say that the drivers of vehicles on the public roads must be licensed. And that's true too.
The birth certificates are issued by the states from, by application of the parents. So there's an automatic, like we had talked about before with Eric, talking about the automatic adhesion of the presumption of law, that they have a right to enforce that just by the fact that you are a state citizen. The rights cannot be considered a tort or some sort of action that can actually be punished. You cannot make a right a crime. You cannot convert a right into a crime. So there's both of those things that exist simultaneously.
Right, and WD's comment is absolutely correct, but it comes down to language again. Drivers of vehicles, we've defined drivers as commercial and vehicles as commercial, right? On the public roads must be licensed. Well, I don't disagree with that. That seems to be the law, but that means that commercial travelers, drivers of commercial cars and automobiles, vehicles, that's who must be licensed.
The essential elements of due process of law are notice and the opportunity to defend.
There's the
Right?
case law to support what we were talking about earlier. Isaac says, isn't the Constitution a dead document invalidated by the incorporation of this country back in 1871? Wasn't that more or less a business agreement only valid between the parties involved at signing? Should we not assume that there is no de jure government currently in place? Constitutional arguments would only be valid in Article 3 courts, of which there are none.
We talked about some of that by operating under trust. He brings up a very good point. He brings up a point about talking of unalienable rights as opposed to constitutional rights, which we are making a distinction of. So I would agree.
I don't know that it's a dead document. There's definitely an essence of truth and reality to what's being brought up here.
It could be dead if it was in the eyes of being in the eyes of God and operating solely under God. But what it does is it can never be a dead document because ultimately the document itself is just a memorialization and a reminder of something that is inherently known. It is not what gives us rights. I don't use that document because it gives me rights. I refer to that document as a portion of an argument or a debate in an attempt to help people understand that which cannot be explained. The unalienable right of a person to do as they wish freely is a freely God-given individual. And that's something that can't be explained. That nobody can explain I am and the rights that I am has to be I am. But what can be explained is the protections that have been founded hundreds of years ago that groups of individuals have agreed upon, similar to the Constitution of Human Rights of the United Nations. It's a different form of constitution. And one could even stand on that under certain protections and certain rights, and some nations do. And they bring cases to Hague Court for it. Is it a dead document because other contracts have been created, other corporations and franchises have been created? No, because they've been created by man. And this declaration is a declaration for all men by all men. And it's very clear. It's for the people by the people, and it's a public trust. And in the future, yes, there's a corporation that is created over it, and we cover a lot of that in our last series, and we talk a bit about the subrogation of rights and how those rights still, once again, we're talking about unalienable rights, things that are incapable of being transferred. Even the mere act of contracting in the attempt to contract away unalienable rights is in effect you using your unalienable right to contract. So it's physically impossible to stop contracting. You cannot contract away your right to contract. And it's the same thing with your right to travel. It's an unalienable right. You have a right to locomotion, to move freely about, to change your situation, to alter your state of being. And this gets into a far more spiritual stance too, and talks about religious standpoints and different forms of transferring from state to state. And that's why the federal government attempts to regulate interstate commerce from state to state.
Well, I can tell you, Isaac, that I have initiated an Article 3 court. I have, in fact, had the flag changed on the standard behind the judge from the gold fringe U.S. flag to a Title IV flag.
And it was crisp too, right?
It was brand new. They'd never had that sucker out of the box before. But they changed it at the lunch break to hear my case. So Article 3 courts do exist when you know how to call them into play. And it's not easy, but it's not impossible. As for whether the Constitution has any merit, I would say it'd be pretty hard to find a judge that's going to ignore the Constitution. You know, one thing to remember is that judges are people too, and they've been drinking the same Kool-Aid as everyone else all this time. Okay, so when, you know, going back to the Mark Twain quote, you know, when where we get our information is it's passed down from one person who didn't examine it carefully to the next person who didn't examine it carefully, and it's all based on the opinion of someone whose opinion isn't worth a brass farthing. Well, that's where the judges are getting their information too. Okay, so they know what they know, and they know a few tricks to keep you in check. But there aren't very many judges that are gonna just ignore the Constitution. You know, they're not going to stand on an argument that you're not in Puerto Rico, so the Constitution doesn't apply. If you were in D.C., maybe it would. No. So, you know, you can make a constitutional argument. You can bring an Article 3 court if you so choose. And, you know, all of that is, in my humble opinion, only necessary if you're giving any form of jurisdiction to the federal forum. Okay, I wouldn't choose to necessarily. I would only choose to stand on a constitutional argument if I had a car registration or a driver's license or maybe insurance through a federal franchise agency, company, corporation that would give a presumption of jurisdiction to the prosecution. Okay, but if I'm left to my own devices to decide how I'm going to operate, it's not going to give them that jurisdiction from the get-go. And we're going to talk about that. This session is really about constitutionally protected rights. Okay, but it's not the only way to handle it, and we're going to talk about other ways of handling it. The other key way being, you know, why are you operating through your person? Your person has a presumption of jurisdiction in the federal forum. So, you know, why are you registering anything? Why are you operating through your person? So when we get it,
about that all night.
yeah, well, you brought it up, but you know, we have an opportunity to choose our jurisdiction, and we're probably going to elect to do that as opposed to standing on constitutional issues. But you know, a lot of people, you know, don't have the complete solution yet, and until you do, the Constitution might serve you well. Let's see. Eric says,
That was really well said. Thank you so much.
thank you. Eric says, original organic Constitution 1787, public trust as given by the one people limits government powers, including the layering over the 1871 District of Columbia contract. It was abandoned in 1862, but did not die. Depends on how far back you need to go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. WD says Article 3 courts exist every time they're called into session by a plaintiff. Yeah.
Thank
No
you.
shit, buddy. All right. Yep. It's true. It's true.
You got to move that court.
Yep.
You got to dunk that. All right. Do we want to move on? Do we have anything else?
Let's move on for now.
Cool.
We got some comments saying Isaac says, no way, I want to do that. I assume he's talking about moving the court to Article 3. Sam says, nice.
You know what? I think that's it for our highlighted. As you can see, there's plenty more to go over. So
It's highlights. That's why it's highlighted.
Yeah, it's what we had time for. It's what was relevant to our conversation tonight. So, God, this was magnificent. I'm really excited about how much fun this was. We had a great conversation.
Let's read this one again. Licensing cannot be required of free people because taking on the restrictions of a license requires the surrender of a right. Cannot be required. Okay? Inalienable right. So it can't be required. Yeah, this is great. I love the audience participation here. This member group is great. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Declaration of Independence, unalienable. And we're going to get more into unalienable. Tonight was mostly inalienable, but we are going to discuss more unalienable as we go. GTEN always strives to uphold and honor all forms of private and public interests. Under no circumstances should you rely on the content of any information given from GTEN in determining any entity's tax or other liability, whether that entity presently exists or is to be created in the future. For all such matters, you should seek appropriate professional assistance from an attorney, certified public accountant, or other professional. GTEN does not give legal advice, nor does it prepare taxes. Void where prohibited by law. Folks, we're not recommending anything. We're just sharing concepts that might help you realize freedom. And whether you choose to enact anything that we discuss here or not, that's up to you.
As you pass our message on to your friends, if you like what we've done and you're enthusiastic, we ask that you pass that as our message, that we are not attempting to teach anyone anything. We want to share, we want to create a conscious, aware community that understand their own rights. They stand under their own unalienable rights as the sentient beings that they are. And so we're looking to raise consciousness to a level that is self-sustainable, that is self-governing. And any way that we can provide any information whatsoever to get there, we encourage from you, and we hope you encourage the same from us. And we hope that you share this with your friends and family, and we hope that this encourages you to be a little more involved in just looking twice. To quote Leary, think for yourself, question authority. It's an important aspect of understanding who we are, is understanding why we're being told what we're told. And my wife reminds me of that all the time. So we're looking to build a conscious community. We're looking to build a community that as one can communicate clearly and concisely with law enforcement and other officials and understand that we are those same people and that we represent their interests and they represent ours. They are not only there to serve us, but we are there to serve them as well. And it serves them well when we respect the individuals that are enforcing laws and we approach our rights with grace and ease, and we express ourselves appropriately, and that we express ourselves in a way that keeps us informed, keeps us safe, and keeps the public's interest safe as well. So these are big factors in what we're doing. Once again, the Dharma. Dharma wraps it up pretty well.
I would say that the message to pass on to your friends is not our disclaimer, but come sign up for Right to Travel because we're having fun here.
No, not a disclaimer.
I gotta share this. This is great. This is one last comment from Sam. This disclaimer is pretty rad. Worth the webinar fee alone. This disclaimer is a modified version of a court judgment, you could say against, but barely against, because in general, the party that got the judgment against them won. But
it was a contrivance that was needed as a contingency for a settlement, is what it was.
Right. It was the settlement of a significant court case regarding trust law, where the DOJ couldn't get anything on them other than, here, you got to put this disclaimer on it.
And we thought it was such a powerful disclaimer, and since the DOJ approved, we thought, well, that's exactly what we're about. It's very important that people understand that this is not about avoiding any kind of issue or.
Right. This is like, if this is what the DOJ wants to see, okay, here you go. We'll put it on there in front. That way you can avoid suing us. because we're not really interested in being sued and would probably just get it dismissed anyway for lack of jurisdiction.
That's funny. Yeah. You're a funny guy.
Folks, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful evening. We're at approaching the end of the third hour here. This has been great, and we look forward to the next one, which will be in about 2 weeks. We'll get the date posted in the next couple days, and I do see. Yes, Sam, it was that case. Yes, I do see the. I do see the note here from Robert. He's requesting certain nights, whatever. We have actually had a number of people that said that requested not Monday, so I think we'll try to switch to Wednesday. But we'll have to look at our calendars, and we will get that posted shortly. Thank you. We love you. God bless. Have a great night.
Good night.